God save our gracious Queen, long live our noble Queen, God save the Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the Queen. O Lord our God, arise, scatter her enemies, and make them fall. Confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks, in the hope with his God save us all. Yeah, why not? Some talk of Alexander and some of Hercules, of Hector and Lysander, and such great names as these. But of all the what great heroes, there's none that can compare with the tow row, 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 row to the British Grenadiers. Yeah. So here in British uniform, it's called usually spilled coffee because it looks a little bit like spilled coffee, but I will not be trying doing it to compare. So as you see, I have here as a tiny British flag, and here there's a symbol of, maybe you know it from history. It's desert rats, of course, desert rats. There's a unit in which is this was precisely an armored division during World War II, which was called Desert Rats. This situation was created in this way that the Minister of Propaganda of Nazi Germany, Mr. Goebbels, has said that the British soldiers are Wüstenratten. That means desert rats, and it was meant to be a slander. To compare the Wüstenfuchs, the desert fox, the noble and intelligent General Erwin Rommel, and desert rats, which would be so inferior in comparison. But the British soldiers decided that there are some positive qualities about rat also, so they decided that they will adapt to precisely that name because rats are resilient, right? They are very tough and it's hard to kill them. So it's a good name. It's not the only case in history when a slander became something positive for the other side and it was adopted by the other side. The different situation are, by the way, this unit is continued today, and they are referring to this armored division that was fighting Erwin Rommel in the desert, and they are using this particular sign even today. There's not a first case in history when something like that happened, then when slander became something which was viewed by the other side, by the opponent, as something positive. The other example could be, for instance, the very famous song of Yankee Doodle. You probably know it. It was first sung in this way with the British accent, of course. Yankee Doodle went to town, riding on a pony. He stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. Yankee Doodle something something, Yankee Doodle dandy. When you're dancing, mind your step, and with girls be handy. It was supposed to be mocking the colonial who is so, not very handy with girls, not very elegant, not very intelligent also, neither. So it was meant to be a slander for the colonials, but the colonials said that, and one of the slander, because maybe this element is not so clear to today's people, because macaroni was a type of wigs used in the last decades in England by the very, very, very fashionable, maybe even over fashionable people in London. Very high wigs, very, very particular, very much elaborated hairdresses, and so they had those powerful wigs, which was even an extravagance in the age of wigs. and it was precisely this sentence to mock the unfortunate colonial American, to point out that he would stuck just one feather in his head and called it macaroni. So that would be like putting, I don't know, second lamp on your bicycle and call it Rolls Royce, something like that. So only a stupid colonial would do something like that, right? So but the Americans said, yes, we are coarse, we are sometimes not very how to say it, we are not so sophisticated, and that's good because the British are over sophisticated. And this song was had even an older version in the 1760s already, when the English were still remembering fighting the French on the well, not border, but on the neutral ground between the Nouvelle France territories. That is something that will be later Canada, and the territory which was controlled by the colonial Americans, the British Americans, or something like that. And there was a rhyme about brother Ephraim who went to war, but he was never able to sleep because he was thinking that the French will come and eat him alive. Yeah, so he proved something, and it was going like, it went like, but coś tam he proved a damned coward. He couldn't something sleep for fear of being devoured. Yeah, something like this. Yeah. So at the beginning of the British-American War, or the American Revolution, or the War of American Independence, in which way you would prefer to call it, the British were first to sing this Yankee Doodle thing, and they will continue do it in English accent, in British accent, and of course the Americans were making their sounds, and during the course of the war, the Americans were singing it more frequently, and the British probably less frequently. But it's not the only song that was shared by the both armies. For instance, you asked me at the beginning to sing the British Grenadiers, which the song that originated probably in the 1690s, so even before 18th century. And precisely about the grenadiers. The grenadiers were supposed to come to 20 meters and throw the grenades, and to something that was really probably braver than being an Alexander or Lysander or Hercules and something like that. So the song was about the grenadiers, and this proved to be very dangerous indeed, and not many grenadiers returned. And for that matter, so they've decided to make them into some sort of crack troop infantry, and instead of being a particular unit just for throwing grenades. So, but when the Americans started the revolution and the War of American Independence started, the Americans used the same rhyme, only slightly changed the melody. It was no longer but rather something like this. And it went like, torn from the world of tyrants beneath this western sky, we formed a new dominion, a land of liberty. So something like this, and was used by the Americans. So, okay, so now I'm looking into your questions. Okay. Desert fox, really big eyes? No, I don't know. Maybe. These are eyes, maybe, I don't know. Intelligence services. But that's a funny thing because the first intelligence services in the world happened in Britain and twice really, because when the British when the English is still before the Union, the courtiers of Elizabeth I, who was the astronomer and astrologist, and he coined the term Great Britain please Elizabeth I, to make her happy, and it was just a name for a long time, and so but it was realized many years later when Scotland came. Well, Scotland really became a part of England, really, but it was called Great Britain. So, in order to make an impression that the Scottish were sort of equals, but not really. So they weren't really. But there were some representatives of Scotland, of course, in the Parliament in London. But really the Scottish affairs were directed by a politician who was always a Scotsman, and he was paid by London, and this office was called a manager of Scottish affairs. So, but still, and in the 16th century, there was only England still, and Scotland was an enemy country in the north. England had more problems with southern European countries, especially with spies from Spain and France. And the spies from France were very, very frequently Jesuits. And to counter the espionage, one of the most trusted and able advisors of Elizabeth I came up with the idea of forming some sort of intelligence service, but it wasn't a professional intelligence service because he was paying those for this counter espionage and later also espionage in Spain and France from his own pocket. He was a person of considerable wealth. So this was practically a private intelligence service. For the real state-run intelligence service, we would have to wait till 18th century, till the Secret du Roi, but it was also half private. So really, we would have to wait till the late 19th century, and here also the British were the trendsetters. So the British were twice first as far as intelligence service is concerned. So in Britain, it was traditionally held as in a great respect. This sort of work, this sort of service for the state. So no wonder the rat would have bigger eyes. I don't know. Victoria sign taken from the Nazis? I don't know what you mean. Victoria sign taken from the Nazis. You mean these? Oh, maybe I know. I thought it was much older. It's hard to tell. Those hand gestures are very tricky to track back in history. For instance, it was well observed in this film *Inglourious Basterds* when the British commander he said 3 beers, yeah, something like this, and the Germans would rather do this 3 fingers, not these 3. So. Well, it could be. I could tell you something about the British Army. The British Army is made in such a way to be a complementary force to the American allies. It's the same thing is with Australian and Japanese forces, for instance. Whereas in case of France, for instance, France has every branch of military well kept and well provided because they are operating as the independent military force. The same with Sweden. So it's not really depending on on how big is the state, how numerous is the population, and so on. It's rather depending on the decisions made. What search engine do I use? Google, of course. There was a funny clip on YouTube. How it would look like if Google were a guy, and there was a guy who was totally had like all the work in the world, and next to him was Mr. Bing, who was very and was a there was a comedic touch to it because Mr. Bing, representing the other search engine, was looking Chinese. So, and he was totally ignored by users, and he was not, and he was waiting for somebody to use the Bing search engine, but never, and contact him, but he was never contacted by anyone. And Mr. Google was all the time had too much work for his nerves and his capability. There was no chance of the for preservation of the English Cromwellian Republic because Cromwell died, and his son Robert was totally unprepared to control all those contradictory interests, and many politicians were already in cahoots with the monarchists abroad, mainly in Holland. So there was no chance. Maybe if Cromwell lived longer, maybe there was the system would be in this scenario better rooted, and maybe in this alternative history line. Kamienie na Sianiec. Yes, I've read it. Yeah, it was obligatory. Please do not mention Mr. Benedict Cumberbatch. He is representing everything I hate about elitists today. Bad acting, being so puffed up, and also he would record a very stupid film against Trump, and now he's in a very stupid film about Brexit. He's of course against Brexit, as every lefty would be, lefty elitist person. So please don't mention even Benedict Cumberbatch, Benedict Cumbershit with me. And he's really looking stupid, by the way, Mr. Cumberbatch. He looks like he's all the time aloof and like there's no mind in his head. There were some Polish people. I don't recall if I was. I don't recall watching any film about Polish people in China on the Irytujący Historic channel, but I know, of course, and because I was I wrote a book about the relations between China and Japan and the West throughout old history of the contacts made. And well, there were some Polish people in Harbin, and there are some books about it. In one of the cities in Harbin. I think the Victoria sign was more universal than that. I think it was already well known in the 19th century, but I don't know. Maybe it was German. I don't know. I thought it was more about the Queen Victoria, and because Queen Victoria was a relative of all the other, maybe not all, but of most of the other monarchs of Europe in late 19th century, and so I think that maybe this sign was borrowed from one country to another. Good afternoon. How is Brazil? How is Brazil this evening? Are you a Bolsonaro guy or maybe more Dilma Rousseff guy? It is possible that Poland will leave the EU soon. Oh, I don't think so because there is no will to. There is a visible will on the part of the Law and Justice Party, the Peace. There is a visible will to make Europe back into something that it was before. I mean, the mainly it was, as you probably recall, it was mainly because about economy first. So at the beginning, so it could be changed back into the state of things as it was before. European Union started to be engaged in everything, as far as also in politics within every member state is concerned. I still think that the Victoria sign this is much more into the past, 19th century probably. And I think that maybe I think the Romans also used it, so it could be, yeah, it could be re-emerging from time to time. I think the Romans used the Victoria sign, yeah, the ancient Romans, I mean, of course, the legionnaires. Yeah, I know Atun Shea. Yes, yeah. He's very left wing, but he still tries to be more or less accurate about the stuff he's telling about. Yeah, Aton Shea is okay. I like his series about checkmate Lincolnites when he's trying to give some answer to the claims of all defenders of the cause of Confederate States of America to and he's trying to counter it, this way of thinking that according to which the Confederate States of America only defended their independence. And he says no, it was really about slavery. No, it wasn't like it wasn't. It is not just this cause, after all. So yeah, and Aton Shea really knows much about it, probably much more than I do. So although I came to be interested when I was still in high school, I came to be interested in history precisely by the topic of the American Civil War. And the 18th century and the other topics came after. Well, the longbow was something that you had to be trained and very particularly trained to operate longbows. Longbows were invented precisely to go through armors of the enemy, and you would have to be trained for that because they were very hard to pull, especially when the weather was there was much humidity in the air, and in England it's a typical situation that you have much humidity in air, so you would have to train for it, and the those troops were the not some sort of additional troops, but the core of the English expeditionary force, so to speak, when it came to wars against France, for instance, in the late Middle Ages. So uh, this was some sort of a first professional army, really, but they were in theory still an addition, only an auxiliary force, but really they were rather a cornerstone of the professional or professionalized, partly professionalized army in England. Whereas in France, they would hire the Genovesians to do their work similar, but they would need the Genovesians, the people from Genova. They were working for the French. They would use rather crossbows. We already cut off. We already have no relations. We already have no real contacts with Belarus. In when we now, when, as we speak, the main representative of the Polish people in Belarus is in jail for taking part in protests against Lukashenko. So we already are totally at odds. The AUKUS alliance is particularly fought as and planned as some sort of an Asian operation to counter the Chinese aggressive steps. So I don't think that any other state of the continental Europe would be welcome in AUKUS. We have NATO already, so why do that? Why go to the AUKUS? But we there is so many uncertainties here. Maybe the Americans will convince the other European states to join the Anglo-Saxon alliance, but it's hard to say in the nearest future because, for instance, the Germans don't really know what to do. They are in two minds. They want to trade with the Chinese, but they also want to stress a little bit that they still are the Western Europeans, and they still are they are still oriented to the Atlantic. So it's not clear if the AUKUS will be transformed in some sort of Anglosphere and political manifestation of the Anglosphere or not. Secret societies are illegal. Should they be legal? No. No, they shouldn't be legal. No. Yeah, Genovese troops were pretty efficient, that's true. But in the same time, when, for instance, it rained, the crossbowers were usually had some problems with the cords and cords or with these strings, and they it was more complicated to put it from the the crossbow. Pojawiła się jaka oficjalnie nie. English, please. I don't understand. Yeah, yeah. Well done, Matthew. It's very, very, very good. Good news is good news. Yeah, I think Polish intelligence and counter-espionage work pretty fine, but I understand why the question here came because, and I understand the why some sort of doubt could occur because, for instance, we can. There are some things in which we cannot really do much about. For instance, we can the Polish counter-espionage can very easily, and sometimes it does, find the um, more dangerous Russian spies and Chinese spies, and sometimes it happens, and they are arrested and so on. And so we know that it is working. Maybe not in every case, but it's working. But I understand how the doubt could occur, could come up. Or I think it's because, for instance, we cannot do much about the things that are the result of the difference of potentials. For instance, the Russians could very easily hire like 100,000 internet trolls, and you cannot really do anything about it. So, whenever something about Polish-Russian relations is mentioned, and some things about the Polish border and the security is mentioned, then you have the army of Russian trolls, and it's not easy to counter their work, right? So, and I think that precisely from things like that, we make our impressions about the efficiency of Polish counter espionage effectiveness. Sorry, effectiveness. So we can be full of doubt, but I think in important stuff, Polish counter espionage is doing fine. Maybe not brilliantly, but fine. If the Germans will be seeking agreement with Russia, then if it will be possible for Poland to survive and grow with close relationships with the Anglo-Saxons, you could very easily reverse the question, and you could say, what would happen to Poland if we hadn't those even rudimentary relations with the Anglosphere? So we have our relationship we have our contacts with the Anglosphere, and it means that maybe we are, and it makes us stronger, even if they have the geriatric Biden as the head of their government. It really does not change much because the Americans would still need somebody to make these observations, to make these reports about Russia, to have somebody here. So, and thanks to these relations, we are more resilient. We are not as endangered as we would be without them. So even if we are not perfectly happy, I think it really helps. And I think that this is discouraging Germans and Russians from going too far. But you must also remember, for instance, that the Germans are making themselves dependent on because of the energy provided by Russian people who are dealing with natural gas. But you must also remember that only 1/3 of that gas, and it will only go up to 40%. And still 1/3, almost 1/3, is provided by Norway, and the other 30% almost is provided by Holland, the Netherlands. So the depending on so the German dependence on the Russians, as far as natural gas and the energetics are concerned, is not as great as we tend to think. Being neutral guarantees nothing. Belgium was neutral. Belgium was neutral in the First World War. Just a small reminder about being neutral. No, it's better to be within an alliance. For instance, the Swedish and the Finns, they are really part of NATO. They are making exercises, military exercises with NATO countries. They are in NATO in everything but name. They just avoid being sent to fight, for instance, the precious soldiers who are needed on spot. They are just saving them from the possibility to be of being sent very far away abroad to fight, for instance, Somali pirates. And they would be obliged to do that if they were members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Yes, it's almost impossible in the age of globalization, and if you have the contradictory interests, and you have always, and then it's very hard. And practically all the neutral countries are not really neutral. For instance, the European Union is also a military alliance. It would be easier to point out what the European Union is not than to point what the European Union is. So the European Union is also trying to make some sort of a common policy in military things and in defense. In defense, and for instance, the Austrians are also a neutral state, but they had to participate in the Eurocorps, in the Eurocorps. Sorry. Anyway, so yeah, nobody is really neutral today. Well, I think that if we tried really hard, that we could make ourselves to be closer to Paris, for instance, basing on some sort of, I don't know, atomic energy cooperation, or with the Swedes based on the common defense system or mechanism with Stockholm and with Kiev, with the Ukrainians and with the Swedes. But I think it's just also a little bit out of habit that we are first and foremost a NATO country. That means pro-British, pro-American. Could you tell something about the forests in the late Middle Ages, especially in England? They were highly controlled by the state, weren't they? Yes, they were, but it's not an untypical situation. What made England special is also that when you have those relations between the lords and their vassals, it was also natural that the king was also the senior, was also playing the role of the additional lord, so lord over lords, but not only the feudal lord would have a relation with his vassals, but also king could make some sort, so give some orders directly to the populace, directly to the vassals. So that's why, for instance, the longbowmen force could be created and was created. And also, but the very idea of having forests controlled in such a way, it's not very untypical. The only difference in the continental Europe, for instance, in France, was that they were controlled more by the local lords and far less by the crown. But it was presumed that forests were privileged for the aristocracy to be able to organize hunting, of course, and in those forests. So there were punishment throughout the Europe. In every country of Europe, there were punishment for people of low origin to hunt in those forests. I think I find the situation in Ukraine fascinating because we have the actor who is now the president of the country, and he's doing pretty fine. He was dependent on the strongest of the oligarchs, and then he got himself out of this relation and he became independent, and now he's even creating laws in order to make it harder for the main oligarch he stepped into office on the back of which. So it is something really worthwhile observing. So it's very interesting to watch, and I think this actor Zelensky, who was a little bit seen as probably unworthy or maybe not well, not political enough. It seems that he's a patriot and he's really doing fine. And I think yes, that if somebody is, we also can observe in every country, and it started maybe with Trump, maybe even earlier, to have some people as heads of government who were not really involved in politics before. And in case of Zelensky, it's just that, and maybe it's the only chance to reform the usual way of doing, the usual rotten way of doing of business in politics. I don't like Britney Spears songs. I also don't like, for instance, Kylie Minogue's songs, but I appreciate Madonna, especially early Madonna, and I appreciate Lady Gaga, even in those crude songs, which are maybe not as sophisticated, but they are still pretty jazzy, and because she started from jazz, exactly, and it's one can hear it even today. So when it comes to as far as the musical talent is concerned, then Lady Gaga is the best, and then Madonna, then Long Break, and then Kylie Minogue, Britney Spears. They pretty much shout instead of singing. Shout or moan. It's moaning, not singing. That's interesting point about German gas dependence. Yes, yes, but only 40%. Is it much or is it not? What's exactly the degree to which the Russians could really um, well blackmail the Germans? The Russians are also depending on dependent on Germans in some ways as the main source of investment in Russia, for instance. Maybe it's an unpopular opinion, but I am somewhat grateful to the President Duda because he is trying to protest our relationship with the USA. Not everyone in the Peace Party share this view, unfortunately. What do you mean protest our relationship with the USA? You mean protect our relationship with the USA? No, I think that, yeah, protect. I think that the well, there can be some disagreement always between Poland and the US, which is perfectly natural because they have just changed the head of state, and the new head of state is to some extent hostage to the more radical lefty politicians. And of course, because we were so involved with Trump and his men, his administration, then we are treated with some mistrust. But just observe the relations the Americans have with the French. This is serious conflict for you, right? So I think that that politics is somehow based on geography, and we will always be an interesting point on the map, just to have some grip on the Russian affairs. So we are pretty much indispensable. We are indispensable. We are not the biggest and the most powerful, the most important ally of the USA, but still we are pretty important. And I think the Polish American relations are far better than what the Polish opposition would like you to think. How the Battle of Agincourt compares to the Battle of Tannenberg in terms of its impact on common popular culture. Mm, I am not sure what exactly do you mean. You mean how much or how often is this battle reminded, or how good it's remembered? Because the Battle of Agincourt is pretty much known mainly from the play of by Shakespeare. Shakespeare made this has written this play entitled Henry V, and the average British person know about the Battle of Agincourt mainly from Shakespeare, not from as some sort of well, of course they discuss it probably during history lessons, but I think they pretty much. I think that it's more probable to know about this battle from Shakespeare. Yeah, the longer the Russians are busy in the Ukraine, the safer we are. In the Ukraine, we say now Ukraine, it's in the Ukraine. Yeah, yeah, the safer we are. Well, maybe I think the Russians pretty much evacuated Ukraine from. I think that the Russian interests evacuated from the Ukraine, of course, with the exception of those two provinces which were culturally pretty much Russian, Donetsk and Lugansk, and regions, and I think, and of course Crimea. So the Russians are busy in those regions, but I don't think that they are struggling to regain control over the rest of the Ukraine. I think it's just the opposite. They completely evacuated their assets from the Ukraine, because we can observe it in every reform presented by the Zelensky's administration, and we can also spot some very serious steps taken towards the real independence of Ukraine from the Russian influence. For instance, we can observe it from the making the Ukrainian Orthodox Church autocephalic. That means that they will be totally independent from Moscow, because they have discovered that too many священники, too many clerics, too many people of church were trying to smuggle some sort of pro-Russian propaganda during the masses. What do you think about truthfulness of a sentence? There is no authority but yourself. Well, as I have already made once a film which is entitled Nie ma autorytetów, są tylko dobre pomysły, and maybe I also even actually made it in English too, the English version, but I'm not sure that they are only good ideas. Yeah, I think yeah, no gurus, just good ideas. For instance, because when you look at the let's take two people who are extremely intelligent and very aware of world's things, world's affairs. For instance, Montesquieu and Benjamin Franklin. They also told very stupid things sometimes. Very, very rarely, but still. So there are no people you could trust without any breaks, right? So you always have to you always have to imagine the situation in which your guru is just going the totally wrong way, and it cannot be avoided. Such a situation cannot be avoided. So, for instance, Montesquieu could be the philosopher whose philosophy was the cornerstone of modern liberalism. Maybe even Montesquieu, of course, alongside Voltaire and Locke and Hume and John Stuart Mill and Benjamin Constant, was the most important liberal thinker. But he also was of an opinion that you should die in the same strata of society you were born in. So it's pretty conservative, right? So even the most liberal thinker among liberal thinkers sometimes was crazy a little bit. Yeah, the same with Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin also coined this expression, which is very near to what I have just observed. For that, every person, even the most bright person, is for 5 minutes of a day a total idiot. So we should remember it, that everybody is entitled to have these 5 minutes of idiocy throughout the day. So there are only good ideas, no people of natural authority, no people that you should blindly trust, right? Just good ideas. Why such a powerful and rich state as Burgundy ceased to exist in 15th century? It's easy. Burgundy was involved in two wars at the same time. That means they were trying to gather as many of the small, not necessarily small, but of the French dukes and princesses against the French monarch, and in the same time, they were trying to consolidate their power all over the Netherlands and over the French language, French-spoken territories, and over Lorraine, which was mixed in this respect, and over the populace and the elites of Switzerland. And the last monarch of Burgundy was fighting precisely the Swiss, and was killed in action. Was killed in the battle. And then Burgundy was, as it was before, surrounded by the Germans and by the French. Both the French monarchs and the emperors of Germany were dealing with the situation in which the territories were theoretically reigned by them, but they had not so much influence over them anyway. So they were not as centralized politically as Burgundy was. But when Burgundy lost the battle, it was very quickly seized. Its territory was very quickly seized both by Germans from one side and by French from the other side. So that's why Burgundy disappeared so easily. What do you mean about military preparation? About military preparation of whom? Military preparation where? In Poland? What are the reasons that the why the British people are so sophisticated? I am not sure if they are sophisticated. I think that they are. There is some sort of the cultural code which make every British person some sort of well, maybe I will put it this way: it's a normal thing that the culture has some sort of cliches, and in British case, the cliche is that the British people should be able to distance themselves emotionally from some elements of life. They should not be so very um, uh, ruled by emotions and so on. And they are also, well, it's almost obligatory for them to have to possess some sort of sense of humor, right? So, so that's that. For instance, the French are obliged, the French are thinking about themselves as the nation of philosophers and writers, and they really are. The French have the, when you compare how many books yearly, per annum is read by a nation, then the French are almost on top, maybe second to the Czechs. The Czechs, the Swedes, the French are very much on the top. And for instance, when you became a writer in France, you have a very good chance to be well provided, because many people would read your novels, your writings, and so on. So it's also encouraging, and it's also create a climate in which it's seen as a natural state of things that the French person would tell interesting tales and would make a philosophical discussions and so on. The same with the English, and the expectation that the British person would be able to distance himself or herself from the most abject emotions, from which the other nations would be not able to distance themselves from. And also that there is an expectation that the British person would be able to tell funny jokes. So, and observing contradictory factors in life. For instance, in Germany, the dark humor is also very well appreciated, but it's not obligatory to make such. What is obligatory in Germany is that you should either be interested in classical music, because Germany is seen, and it's also have this auto stereotype as being the country of people interested in culture, in classical music. There are so many even smaller cities who are really trying very hard to, and they are taxing themselves very highly to provide for the local orchestras. And it's expected from every German person, really, almost every, in many circles, to know something about Bach and Brahms and Beethoven. Not so much in England. It's not seen classical music, although there are many interesting composers in France and in Britain. It's not expected of a average British or French person to be so very much informed about classical music, for instance, of having the so whereas the Germans are sometimes even lying that they are interested in classical music because they are the country of classical music. So there is some sort of expectation that the German should be a little bit of a classical music expert. There is an expectation for a French people for that the French person would be interested in philosophy and even making some well writing some tales and so on. There is an expectation for a British person to be sophisticated and distanced and having a sense of humor, preferably dark humor, because it would combine the predilection for the sense of humor with the distance. Because what is really the dark humor is distance, emotional distance from death and suffering and so on, right? So seeing the positive and comedic elements in also the less joyful elements of life, or death, or dying and so on. And in America, for instance, maybe with the exception of the Jewish New York and the Jewish parts of New York and the Italian parts of New York, you are not expected to be so very much focused on being funny, right? So they have this less developed, but Americans should be the winner, should be effective, and so on. And this is the range of American sets of expectations, right? So every nation have different sets of expectations, and you have to, even if you are revolting against those, as I am, as a little bit of a Germanic mind trapped in Poland. For instance, the Polish people are very big on hospitality. You should be hospitable even if the guests are not willing to eat or stay. You should still try to feed them and keep them, right? Keep them and feed them in this chronological order, preferably. So and that's fine. But the Polish people also have the tendency to promise everything to everyone, which is not funny, I think. For instance, the German people usually abstain from promising anything, but if they promise something, they will do it. And the Polish people promise many things in vain, and many promises are broken. So different sets of expectation. That's why the English seem so sophisticated that they not really are. Totally, they cultivate the individualism because it's also seen as something British. So when they cultivate the individualism, and they also have this proclivity to humor, preferably dark humor, they can be seen as more sophisticated than some other nations. But it's just different set of expectations. My point is that Russia won't start any serious conflict against NATO countries without pacification of the Ukraine, because if they did, the Ukraine would try to reclaim its land with NATO support. Well, it all depends how far Russia would go. If they only try to nibble a little bit from the Baltic nations, they can risk it safely, being still engaged in the eastern parts of the Ukraine. But if they try something harder, as the total war with Poland, for instance, in Poland and so on, then it would be impossible, right? So serious conflict. Maybe. I think the Russians could, what they really could do in our region, and do it pretty easily, and that's the most sinister version of events. The most sinister scenario would be that they would try to destabilize Latvia, because the Latvians are emigrated on a large scale to Britain, actually. And when they do, they usually are dispersed among other diasporas of immigrants from various countries, and they very often stick to Polish and Czech people, and they after a short period of time that they are switching to Polish and Czech languages, and Latvian, and because almost 1 million from the 3 million country emigrated abroad, then the Latvians are less numerous in relation to their Russian-speaking minority than before, and Latvia is more prone to be destabilized than before. And that's something the Russians, not with Estonia, not with Lithuania, but with Latvia, they could try doing some destabilizing. And I'm afraid that NATO would not be able to do much about it because it would be totally interior. Well, from the perspective of the people outside, it would look like something like some well like some interior politics of Latvia. So why should the other countries be engaged? So the Russians could really destabilize Latvia, and it's not so much we could do about it. I am not sure that the Battle of Tannenberg in today's Germany it's so mythologized. I don't think so. Well, Agincourt is in England because Agincourt proved that the English, which were in the number of not even 4 million back then, were able to fight with great success against the French, which were the nation of 12 million back then. Because we have this tendency of seeing the British and the French as well, roughly the nations of roughly the same sizes. It's not true. In almost during the almost whole course of their histories, Britain was far less populated than France. It was more according to the size of the countries, and we must remember that France is almost twice as big as Britain. Britain, which became so highly so densely populated in the early 19th century, when they had this unprecedented industrial revolution, which make the British numerous big nation. So the British know that they were not always a very big nation, very numerous nation, and still they take much pride in being able to fight successfully against the more populated France. I would be Hamiltonian because Hamilton based his ideas on experience. He based all this on the principles of the only successful and well spread theory of the 18th century economics, that is, of course, mercantilism. Because there were only two exceptions of the mercantilist tendencies, which was the small number of French intellectuals called the laissez-fairistes, or the what was the other name? Physiocrats, les physiocrats, and the other exception was the small circle around David Hume and Adam Smith and the other Scots and some English men were Englishmen who were also interested. So small circles of the free traders. So Hamilton's politics was based on experience, on business, on knowing this stuff thoroughly, whereas Jeffersonian ideas were based mostly on his ideals, sometimes even prejudices against, for instance, the city. He was very much prejudiced against the city life. He was thinking all the time that the cities swallow everything, and I even recorded. Maybe you know I have recorded my version of a dialogue that is happening in the miniseries entitled John Adams, about the second president of the United States, chronologically. And I have also played the role of Jefferson in Hamilton, making it like, one scene after another, sentence spoken by Jefferson, then sentence spoken by Hamilton. I was playing both sides, of course, in different costumes, different wigs, different frocks, and the Jefferson, he said something in the film and in my film also, in the original film and in my film, that all cities swallow everything in their way, and that's why I abhor them. I hate them. Right, abhor. It was the more fashionable word back then for hate, abhor. So he was disgusted by the idea that business life in independent America will be concentrated in the north, and most particularly in the big cities like Philadelphia and New York and Boston. And well, this approach maybe had some base in his agrarian philosophy, but it's not very realistic. So he was more of a drawback in this than an advantage. He was instrumental in writing the main core of the American Constitution, but when it came really to constructing the nations, in creating the nation, then Hamilton and Hamiltonian ideas were very, very much better. The essence of the British or English humor is the distance from seeing the positive elements in tragic events. This philosophical approach. For instance, when somebody fell from the boat and was drowning, then the British would say, "Oh, jolly good swimmer, happy swimmer, happy camper," something like this. Even, for instance, she was chased by a bear. He barely survived. Happy camper, something like this. And for instance, when it's very British also, for instance, during the Sense of Life by Monty Python. Maybe you remember this scene when the British 19th century encampment was attacked by the Zulus, and one of the officers, instead of being responsible for the defending of the camp, was still shaving, and when one of the arrows of a Zulu warrior shattered the glass, he was only saying and still trying with one of the pieces of this mirror of the glass. He was trying to continue the shaving. So yeah, that's something very British. That yeah. And I think the British have a very good constitution to be imperialists and to really have a large responsibility over vast amounts of land, because the British are distanced, they are not afraid, they are not easily scared, and they are, because they are a little bit phlegmatic at the beginning and then energetic when it's needed, and not energetic when it's not needed, like the French or the Italians. And the English also, well, they also had tea, for instance, and tea is giving very much energy. So yeah, very good constitution for being in imperialistic nation. Considering that England was a colonial empire, Britain, yes, Britain was. Having contacts with many cultures and around the globe, why the cuisine is so dull and boring? I disagree. I disagree. That's why I will of course answer the question, but I am never allowing this to be written that the English cuisine is boring. Although the British are sometimes joking themselves about the topic, English cuisine is not boring. English cuisine is the meat, for instance, cooked or baked in the with some sort of mm, baked, not rolls, but you know what I mean. Um this mixing between cake and meat. This is British cuisine. They also when we also discuss, for instance, the grilled steaks. For instance, we usually assume that it's an American cuisine, but it's really British also. So British cuisine is powerful, and the scrambled eggs, it's also British. So, and the fish and chips is also British. Many dishes with fish and so on. I think the our assuming that the British cuisine is dull is the result of Britain being an island nation, and island nations used not so many spices. That's observed in various parts of the world, that islanders use rarely and scarcely spices. So, but when they added spices, it's a good cuisine. I have also the impression that maybe because our climate is well, not as cold as it was in 18th century, the uh, the dishes that are providing so many calories and energy are not longer required. But I remember the Pluffman's lunch. Pluffman's lunch is a very complicated, some sort of very complicated sandwich that you would eat in the morning, and you would have energy to make the work in the fields for the whole day. I remember when I went to English bakery, or was this some shop? I don't remember exactly, because those Pluffman's lunches are served in many different joints, and I ate this Pluffman's lunch, and I had energy, or just the ordinary British breakfast with toasts and scrambled eggs and many different, and bacon and so on. And I would have energy for going walking throughout London for the entire day, and from 10 p.m. to like 11, not 11, 19. I mean, sorry, from 10 a.m. till let's say 7 p.m. I had sufficient energy for everything. So yeah. And now, when the climate is getting warmer and so on and so on, maybe we tend to appreciate more Southern European cuisines, and that's the only reason why the English cuisine is not appreciated. But if you someday you go to London, I very strongly recommend going to the restaurant, which is situated just next to um, the Monmouth Road. This is a big road connecting Holborn with Westminster, and I suggest you to go to the Browns, which is the restaurant that is looking very expensive, but it's not that as expensive as it looks, and they are serving British cuisine and meat baked in various combinations, and it's very tasty. So yeah, I gather when the people criticize English cuisine, I also always ask, But what exactly do you mean, English cuisine? And they don't know what they mean. Fish and chips? Well, cake and meat together? Mashed potatoes? What exactly do they mean? And the beefsteaks? They are all good, very tasty, very energetic. And the English breakfast, it's the best. So yeah. As I said, the cultural expectations from a Polish person would be hospitality for guests. Even if they are saying that they are not hungry, then they must go. We are trying to keep them and feed them. I think that yeah, that's our main expectation. For instance, and this could be even manifested in very abject forms. For instance, in 17th century Poland, it was very typical that a French person would pass the village and the local feudal, the local Sarmatian, would invite him to dinner and feed him and saying, no, no, you don't have to go yet, and you are my guest, and you stay another week. And he's feeding him for 1 week after another, and the Frenchman is already having problems with digestions and so on with the strong alcohol that he's provided with and so on. So yeah, French or Italian or any different, even the German. So because in 17th century the Germans were not portrayed as some sort of eternal enemy of the Polish nation, it happened afterwards in 19th century. Yeah. So, and the same, for instance, in Sauberkeit, that means the cleanliness, in keeping the houses clean. In 17th century Brandenburg, it was sometimes, it came to very dangerous situations when wives dissatisfied with their husbands bringing the dirt from the road to their flats and well spoiling the order of the house and bringing the filth. They would even make not only a big quarrel about it, but sometimes even beat the crap of the husband, sometimes with the mortal result. So yeah, so being clean sometimes also can have abject forms and dangerous forms, like our hospitality, ending with digestive problems for the guest. No, there is no country where energy price is not going high. Well, maybe France, but I'm not sure. I think it's going high, but not slower than in different countries, in other countries. No, I'm very happy about my academic career. I never really never really thought about becoming an officer. Well, it's interesting that the British life in the 70s and 80s gave us both skinheads and punk subculture. That's interesting. Then in the 1970s, Britain was some sort of trendsetter for the whole of Europe, and in the and both one would say they both radical ends were provided with some sort of proposal. That means for the radical righties, it was the skinhead subculture, and for the radical leftists, there was a punk subculture. Well, I already made a film about Margaret Thatcher and the welfare state in Polish. So just very shortly, Margaret Thatcher liquidated the whole sectors of British economy, and I think it was unnecessary. Yeah, but it was, to some extent, it was the result of the unforgiveness of the uh, British trade unions. But from some particular moment on, it was already unnecessary to liquidate the whole sectors of economy just to punish some trade unionists. Yes, stew inside the cake. Yeah, yeah. It could even be soup inside the cake. Yeah, in British cuisine. Really many interesting and tasty dishes. It's so usually people criticize British cuisine. It's probably because they are expecting that if Britain is a nation of roughly the same size as France, they should really probably having well a vast vast choice of uh, of dishes, and it's not obligatory, and it's only an island, and they are in one climate zone, whereas France is in three climate zones. So I think it's the contrast with the French that makes us think that British cuisine is something not worth mentioning, although it is worth mentioning. But when you put, when if you, for instance, would take Spanish cuisine and put it next to French cuisine, the Spanish cuisine will not look that great. So it's some sort of putting anything except maybe Chinese cuisine next to French cuisine makes the cuisine that you are putting next to French cuisine look very poor. So, is this really fair? The French are blessed with the climate, and they are situated at the meeting point of two climate zones. And they are really a country, because when you mention the Massif Central, then you have really three climate zones. The Massif Central being the third, and every region with different cuisines. So it's not fair to compare with the French, because the French are blessed with the climate and possibilities of cultivation of different stuff. So well, in First World War, Poland was not really participating because there were Poles, but there was no Poland. So the Poles were killing other Poles sometimes, just because first group of Poles would wear Austrian or German uniforms, and the other Poles coming um, against them were in Russian uniforms. So, and Poland was still the most devastated country during World War One, although there was no Poland politically. So that's something. During World War Two, it was just a natural way of think that we were the first victim of the Nazi um, well expansion, and that's understandable, so to speak, right? So yeah, the British have good constitution. I mean, mentally and physically, being from northern climate and being from the country which is has focused on the sea, and yeah, they have, and with tea, with distance and emotional distance, and the understanding that there is a tragic element in life and so on, and it's also funny sometimes. Yeah, they have good constitution to be explorers, and yeah. The Great Northern War was going simultaneously with the Grand Hiver, the Big Frost of 1709. In 1709, there was a big frost that killed many civilians and as well as soldiers. So, and it was like a Spanish influenza for the World War One, almost. And we have also the real civil war going on during the Great Northern War. Will Poles heal their complexes towards, you mean the inferiority complex towards the West? Yeah, probably. I think the Law and Justice Party demonstrated already that it's possible. But the opposition parties are still thinking that we are garbage when compared to the West, and it's very sad they think so, because they really think so, and it's sad. So I think that we are divided on the line of having having this and feeling this inferiority complex in relation to the West, and to people who are just thinking about themselves as the Spaniards of the East or the French of the East, which is far more accurate. There is a Czech joke about Poles that the Poles are the subtype of Russians who imagine themselves to be more like the French. But I think that it's just. Uh, I think this imagining of being some sort of French of the East or the Spanish of the East is proper. I think it's okay, and I think that could provide us with some sort of leverage to deal with our inferiority complex. Yes. Okay. So I had also, to some extent, inferiority complex as far as my Polishness is concerned, but when I started dealing with the people from Western Europe who were not always better informed, not always better understanding the world affairs and so on, I got rid of those of this inferiority complex. So I think maybe it's just a matter of being not able to confront so often with the people of the West. Yeah, the Scots. Well, the small group of Scots is always focused on on independence, and being a Scottish person, you are always praising freedom, and you are culturally unable to counter it. But it does not mean that most people will support independence. Although it was totally possible to get independence in this voting procedure, for instance, in Catalonia, the Madrid government forbade it explicitly that even if the voting would take place in Catalonia for leaving, that it would not mean that it would be legal. So, but still, legal or not, they have organized the referendum in Catalonia. And although the those Catalonians who were interested in getting out of of Spain and forming their own country, it turned out during this referendum that it's maybe 30% of them were really interested in getting independence, and because they were a very noisy minority. The same with the Scots. much more people watch my much more people watch my films generally in form of already published films than during those live uh, broadcastings. So so I just put those films on different groups I have on Facebook, and they are looking to them afterwards. Usually, far more often than participating in the actual discussion. I don't know why it's so. Maybe my channel is to some extent labeled as a Polish channel, so they are not expecting this, and maybe that's why they don't engage so much. But on Facebook, and then they really watch them. So this encourages me to make from time to time also English or German, or far less often in different languages. Also, some small percentage of films also in English and German. Ireland, not. Ireland, no. But because Ireland was controlled to some extent from the Middle Ages already by the English, but Scottish people tried to organize before the union with the English from 1707. They tried to get their own colonies in South America, which I don't remember the name of the colony, but the Scots really tried it, and but they were, well, because Scottish was already Scotland was already gravitating towards the English, towards the Union. It all everything miscarried, and they were even surrounded by Indians, and but the I don't remember the name of the colony. They were surrounded by Indians, and the English didn't help because they didn't have a common interest. They had only they were only they were only connected by the dynasty of of Stuarts, the Stuart family. So yeah, the English didn't help, and the Scottish had some problems with it, but they also realized that they cannot afford having their own colonial system. So they that was became not an argument so much for the continuous hatred for the English against the English, but more an argument for getting into the union with the English. It was in the late 17th century, and I have read about it in one of Norman Davis's books, probably the Isles, because it's about Britain. So, and he, being a person of Celtic origin, would exactly put some stress on situation like that. I was in Corsica this year, and also have some feelings towards the independence. Yeah. Mhm. Well, 18th century, except for Poniatowski and except of French Revolution, American Revolution, is very much underappreciated. I'm afraid that's because we tend to totally. It's a huge difference between Poland and Western Europe in this respect also, that we tend to think that the modernity starts in the late 18th century, maybe really in only in 19th century. Whereas it's normal in the Western countries, or the Western European countries, to make 18th century as a whole, so already the early 18th century, as some sort of the the time of birth of modernity in every respect. So in England, in Germany, In France, even in Spain, 18th century is some sort of a new start, a new beginning. You have the Hanoverians in England, you have the parliamentary system, you have the Kingdom of Prussia in Germany, and those independent Prussian politics and influencing the other German states. You have the new Bourbon dynasty, French dynasty in Spain, instead of the foul Habsburgs, and the new beginning. Whereas in Poland, 18th century is some sort of the last years of the old system before partitions. So we generally underappreciate the 18th century, although we should really be focusing more on the Saxon dynasty, which really changed a lot in Poland, and but we are not doing it yet, not so much. Sometimes Jacek Staszewski and the other historians try to changed it, but not not they didn't really made it. How is the British are proud of their healthcare when it's really underwhelming, to put it underwhelming? It means that uh, no, it's crumbling. What you meant is crumbling, and I think you exaggerate. I think the healthcare system of Great Britain really stood firm against COVID, for instance. So I think it is more or less okay. Of course, in healthcare system is in trouble in many countries, in Italy, in Spain. So it doesn't really tell so much. Maybe our expectations against the set, where I am using this term frequently. But underwhelming means that, as you would use the word underwhelming if for instance, the healthcare system would have some enemies, and the enemies would be underwhelmed by the healthcare system. Yeah. In some respect, everything is terrible everywhere. So it doesn't really mean anything. What I was trying to say is that the our sets of expectations are sometimes set too high, and we assume that it's a rich country and that everything would go smoothly. It's not. It's not. Nowhere is the healthcare system spotless and without problems. Okay, so with the healthcare system, I think we may conclude this. Underwhelming? Ah, okay, yes, underwhelming. I thought overwhelming. Okay, overwhelming, underwhelming. I've understood overwhelming. Yeah, yeah. Underwhelming. Yeah, yeah. Why not? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I thought you meant overwhelming. Okay, I'm already tired, so yeah, yeah. So it's okay, it's okay. Yeah, yeah. Underwhelming, yeah. But it's underwhelming when you assume that it would function without any problems. So, and why would you assume that? Every country has problems. In Switzerland, you cannot go by night because you could be attacked by an Albanian, some Albanian immigrant. In Germany, also problems, especially in swimming pools and so on, with the new Germans and so on. Every country has big problems, different problems. For instance, in America, you have a fantastic medical service. You have more freedom to getting more freedom to get to the details of medical information, and you are far more able to prepare uh, medicines for yourself in contact with your private doctor and so on. But in the same, and that you have also palliative treatment on a very high level indeed, and far better than in Western Europe. In Western Europe, when you have an elderly patient, you usually help him to die. In America, you are saving him to the last minute. That's why, among other things, American healthcare system is so costly and sometimes unfair. So the so the advantage on one field sometimes means that in some other respect you would have great problems. So yeah, German declination, it's very easy. German declination is very easy. Well, you are only, the only problem is the so-called weak weak nouns. So not des Studenten, des Elefanten, instead of, for instance, des Metzgers, for instance, or des Kochers. Yeah. So yeah, that's the only complicated thing in German declination. You just change articles. Yeah. Okay, so it's a new topic, and I think that um, I think we can conclude with this. Okay, because I'm already tired a little bit, so I think it's a good moment to say, well, see you and see you. Mm, as the French say, bon fin de soirée. Have a good end of the evening.